lifting up Jesus, opening His Word from Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, Thailand, the Philippines, United States, and throughout the world. You're watching Moriel TV.
Donald Trump coin, we have Cyrus, we have Donald Trump, here we have Cyrus Balfour Trump declaration. We have in Hebrew Sarat Torres Balfour Trump, and we have the temple which has the spread.
A few months ago, President Donald Trump declared that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. The holy Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. We want to say thank you. We want to show our gratitude to that big declaration, and that's why we put President Donald Trump next to King Cyrus on our special coin. The income from these donations are going to be used for the rebuilding and education of the Third Temple. The temple belongs to everybody, to the Jewish nation, but also to the whole world. So we're starting with the people of Israel, we're starting maybe with the Trump base, but I'm sure that maybe through Trump, everybody will understand not how Donald Trump is important, but how important Jerusalem and the temple is for the whole world.
It felt good to buy this coin because I liked what Trump said, his declaration that he's going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. I think it's a very important statement. And like Kores that helped the Jewish people establish itself in our Holy Land, it felt nice to have this coin and have a memory of this time and what he did.
Hi, this is Tim from Moriel TV and Moriel Radio, here live via Skype in England with James Jacob Prasch, and this is This Week in Prophecy.
Blessings in Jesus, dear friends. Wonderful to be with you from the UK at the moment. This is, once again, This Week in Prophecy. Before moving on to events in the Middle East, let's begin this week in Europe and in Great Britain. The Vatican is putting dampers on reports in the Italian press and in various international news agencies, as well as websites, that Pope Francis has declared his belief in annihilationism, that there's no such place as eternal hell, that those who do not repent of their sins will simply disappear. The Vatican spokesman is saying that the remarks attributed to whom he calls the Holy Father are not in the context the Pope spoke them, and are a reconstruction by the newspaper editor and owner Eugenio Scalfari, who in fairness is 93 years of age. The Pope is not a young man either. Nonetheless, the Republican newspaper in Italy has not recanted, and the Pope has himself not spoken to the issue. It was a statement issued by the Vatican, and it does not stipulate that it was even issued at his personal instruction or behalf. This Pope has become renowned for a number of controversial statements. Most recently, the one that resulted in riots and actual physical attacks on his entourage in Latin America, following statements in support of a prelate, a bishop, alleged to have protected pedophile priests, saying that those who are raising these issues against him are guilty of slander, that he has no proof that it actually happened, while the locals are claiming there is abundant evidence that it actually did. More than this, the Pope spoke to the issue of homosexuality, saying that if two men are in a committed same-sex relationship, quote unquote, who is he to judge? Those were his exact words.
And here was the moment that is getting so much attention.
Si una persona è gay,
The Pope saying, quote, if someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? Compare that to Pope Benedict, who called gays objectively disordered, or John Paul II, who called homosexual acts against natural law.
If this statement is true, it would move the Catholic Church away from its catechism, even away from its de fide doctrine that was always in the imprimatur and nihil et obstat literature, that is official Roman Catholic doctrine of the Catholic Church, Vatican approved, into the sphere of annihilationism. Quite a subject, quite a controversy. It would be appropriate for the Pope himself to issue a direct statement clarifying what he said and what he actually meant. Nonetheless, these are the reports that have come out of Italy, and these are the reactions to it. Let's move on. There was a demonstration of British Jews and others opposing the government in waiting, as they like to think of themselves, of Jeremy Corbyn, that is the British Labour Party. The amount of anti-Semitism expressed by the radical left within the British Labour Party has reached a degree that has been described in the media as having reached a boiling point.
It's the eve of Sukkot, and this Jewish community in North London is preparing for 7 days and 7 nights of festivities. But the streets are shared with a noticeable police presence, and a report released today might help explain why. Hate crimes against Jews have increased by nearly a third since 2010, according to the Home Affairs Select Committee report, and the volume and viciousness of online abuse is unprecedented. It's all news that comes as no surprise to the community.
We will get calls from visibly Jewish people, whether it's in London, North Manchester, Gateshead, Leeds, other places, who tell us that on a regular basis when they walk to and from synagogue, they get abuse shouted at them by people on street corners, by people from passing cars. They may get stones or coins thrown at them. And for too many people, this is something they feel they have to put up with because it's just part of being Jewish.
The report shows an 11% rise in anti-Semitic incidents in the first half of this year compared to 2015. It also shows the number of people in Britain with anti-Semitic attitudes rose by 50% in just 12 months. And as many as 1 in 20 adults in the UK could now be characterised as clearly anti-Semitic. Daniel and Theo are barely in their teens, children who say they've had vicious hate shouted at them by grown men.
We were getting onto a bus and a car was driving by, and seeing as we were wearing our suits and our kippah on our head, the car slowed down and shouted, "You Jewish."
I was just thinking, why do they feel that way just because we're Jewish? I just felt it was unfair, and I just hadn't experienced anything like this before.
As bleak a picture as this report paints of anti-Semitism across the whole of the UK, some of the most critical lines are reserved for the Labour Party, saying there is, quote, safe space for people with vile attitudes towards the Jewish people. It also goes on to say that on this issue, Jeremy Corbyn has shown, quote, a lack of consistent leadership. It's of a different order to criminal hate speech, but the report cites cases like Naz Shah, who was suspended by the Labour Party for anti-Semitic Facebook posts before being elected to Parliament, and Ken Livingstone, who defended her before making further inflammatory comments. He was suspended too, but Ms Shah was allowed back into the party less than 3 months later.
Every political party has a problem and can and needs to do much better on tackling anti-Semitism. But let's not beat around the bush. The Labour Party has a particular problem with anti-Semitic incidents at the moment over the last year, and that's under Jeremy Corbyn's watch, I'm afraid.
Jeremy Corbyn today has criticised the report for unfairly focusing on Labour. He also said that under his leadership, Labour has taken greater action against anti-Semitism than any other party.
Corbyn himself refused to take down a painting that was a canvas adaptation of a description from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an anti-Semitic forgery that was basically a manifesto for Jew hatred in Eastern Europe, and which was used as propaganda by everyone from the Nazis to radical Islamic groups. This growing anti-Semitism, riding on the back of anti-Zionism in the British Labour Party, has stirred Jews who are still on the political left and are supportive of Labour, and it has caused something of a crisis even among non-Jews within the Labour Party. We've been warning about Jeremy Corbyn for some time on a number of issues, one of which is his position towards Israel and the Jews. It is imperative that there be no Labour government and that Jeremy Corbyn be removed from the leadership of the Labour Party in the UK by the hand of God, if that is possible with prayer, and it certainly is. But it also brings home the fact that, as in the United States, you have the rank folly, the naivety, the gullibility of left-wing and left-center Jews, trying to ignore the fact that the left is increasingly being taken over not just by anti-Zionism, but by anti-Semitism. You wonder what Jews in the media, such as Zucker at CNN and others, are actually doing with this growing anti-Semitism and Jew hatred, as if they themselves will not ultimately be the victims of it. Well, they will ultimately become the victims of it, and it's taking place already on university campuses throughout the United States and Great Britain, as well as in other countries. This is growing, and it's highly problematic. In a sense, more troubling is what has been taking place in Germany under the Merkel regime. We've been warning about this for some time, with court decisions exonerating radical Muslims, saying that their attacks on synagogues were political statements and not hate crimes. The invitation to bring more than 1 million unvetted Muslim immigrants from Syria and other countries into Germany, on top of the Islamic population they already have, despite the attacks on German women that were publicly recorded last Christmas and New Year in open city square celebrations in Germany. And it's getting worse. But now we have the firing by a government-subsidized German corporation in Jordan of the German Corporation for Cooperation, which distributes humanitarian aid paid for by the German government. Because one of their employees made a statement concerning an Arab Muslim woman who began slapping Israeli soldiers in the face, walking up to them and just began slapping them, that if this had happened in Jordan, she would have been shot, she was fired. But at the same time, there have been people in the employ of that same so-called corporation funded by the German taxpayer that have done things that are absolutely outrageous, including putting a swastika on the Israeli flag, and they've done so with impunity. The complete bias of the Merkel regime and the German government has been absolutely shocking. We see the growth of anti-Semitism once again, not just anti-Zionism, in Germany and also now in Great Britain. It's happening with the British Labour Party. It's happening with the media. It's happening with the German government and with its agencies. This has led to an increase in immigration into Israel from Europe. But again, what is prophesied in Scripture? I will gather them from the lands of the north. They are being forced to immigrate to Israel due to anti-Semitism. The question is, will that eventually come to the United States? Courtesy in part of the stupidity of the voting majority of the American Jewish community, Alan Dershowitz having had the personal integrity to admit how naive he was about Barack Obama. He is at least at last telling the truth about the co-chairman of the Democratic Party, Keith Ellis, and his anti-Semitic association and alliance with the Nation of Islam, extremely anti-Semitic and extremely anti-white racist organization of Louis Farrakhan. I'm hard-pressed to understand, in light of history, in light of the Holocaust, how Jews in Western democracies can be so gullible and so stupid. We are reminded of the gullibility of German Jews because of the role Germany accorded the Jews and because of the influence so many Jews had on the German-speaking world in the late 19th and early 20th century. No one could believe the Holocaust would take place where it did in Germany and in Austria. It would have seemed more likely to be centered in a place like France or Russia, but rather it happened in Germany. It's unbelievable, the failure of people to learn the lessons of history and to learn the lessons of their own scriptures. Nonetheless, this is the hand of the Lord, and it is transpiring this week in prophecy. Jews are being forced from France, from Europe, and ultimately, quite possibly from Great Britain, to go to Israel. Now, I'm speaking here of certain members of my own family, potentially, who are, of course, Jewish believers. Nonetheless, prophecy marches on this week. Once again, some of the most potentially dramatic and significant news is being underreported in the West. The Kuwaiti press, Al Jadeed, reported that this week in prophecy, for the first time, American-made F-35 jets flown by Israeli pilots using a combination avionics package of American and Israeli electronic countermeasure software and hardware invaded Iranian airspace over 3 cities, Bandar Abbas, Isfahan, and Shiraz. All 3 of these cities housing major facilities in Iran's nuclear armament development program. If this is true, if the Israeli Air Force flying these newly designed American F-35s were able to make that kind of an incursion into Iranian airspace, they would have successfully evaded the detection and anti-aircraft missile systems provided Iran by Russia. It would have been a first real test on a larger scale of the performance capacity of the American F-35 against anti-aircraft systems and guided missiles for intercepting them, as well as the detection of them by both airborne, satellite, and terrestrial radar systems. It would be a big, major step proving the superiority of the American and, to a degree, the Israeli technology against the state-of-the-art Russian material. There was no challenge by any Iranian aircraft. Not only that, if the reports are true, they were able to lock on to targets. If you can lock on to a target, you can almost certainly hit it. Once you have a lock on, it's usually too late to save the target had the Israelis wished to fire. Now again, Israel has not verified these reports. The United States has not verified these reports. The reports are coming from Arab countries in the Persian Gulf. The Iranians have not said a word. But if it is true, it would also mean something very drastic diplomatically. It would have been impossible for the Israelis to have reached Iran without overflight consent from the Saudi Arabians, where American-provided AWACS planes would detect anything coming, or with the consent of the Jordanians and possibly the Iraqi government, possibly the Iraqis. There would have been a high degree of cooperation between the Saudis, the Emirates, and Jordan, at least, for such an operation to have taken place. Now, this is not simply a warning to Iran, if it indeed happened. This goes beyond a warning. For some time, Israeli aircraft have been flying the equivalent distance with the secret cooperation of the government in Greece in the opposite direction, flying towards the west and northwest to simulated targets in Greece that would be equidistant with the targets that would have to be taken out in Iran. Not only that, but there would have to be an aerial refueling capacity, and that would, of course, require the overflight of tankers over Arab airspace, highlighting the secret and growing, or perhaps not so secret, cooperation between Saudi Arabia, under Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his new regime, the Emirates, United States, and Israel. John Bolton, for some time, the new American National Security Advisor, has been urging Israel to take out targets in Iran. But it is no longer something that's being done to intimidate Iran or to warn them. If it happened, this was a practice mission. They wanted to find out if they could actually do it and if they could evade the Russian detection systems. It appears they can. The only way that this could have been achieved without overflight and without aerial refueling over Arab airspace is if Saudi Arabia actually allowed for the refueling of Israeli aircraft at Saudi air bases secretly. Now, this is much less likely a scenario, but such an operation could not have been carried out without the willing participation, not just consent, but participation of the Gulf states and of Saudi Arabia. If these reports coming out of Kuwait and the Emirates are true, it would also, again, mark a very, very significant test of the performance capacity of the F-35. The United States has always used Israel as a testing ground to improve and modify designs on its aircraft by McDonnell Douglas, by General Dynamics, etc., against Russian MiGs, Sukhois, and other Russian-manufactured aircrafts supplied to Arab states. And so this saga continues. And it continues this week in prophecy. Let us continue this week in prophecy. The next Christ in the checkpost, love Christ, hate Israel, is being planned to take place once again.
So are you saying that by its behavior at the moment, the Zionist state of Israel is setting Israeli Jews up to be exiled again?
Yes, I am, unfortunately. Unless they learn to repent and recognize, if you like, the writing on the wall, and recognize that they must share the land and find reconciliation.
And
We've done it in Europe.
treat those they live among and who live among them equally.
Yes, we've done it in Europe after the Second World War. We've seen it in South Africa. We've seen it in Northern Ireland. And that's our responsibility.
This will be the first major one where Stephen Sizer, now retired from the Anglican ministry, can go full public again without the restrictions placed upon him by the Church of England, after on the internet he charged Israel with involvement in the September 11th terrorist attacks in New York. It'll be interesting to see what happens and how far this goes at this present time. Undoubtedly, there will be indignation expressed, and much of it expressed, over the decision of the Trump administration to relocate the American embassy to Jerusalem. Related to this week in prophecy, we have the public statements by a prominent rabbi in Jerusalem. It's most interesting what he's actually saying. This rabbi, who is the rabbinic chaplain of King David's tomb, Rabbi Yosef Berger, believes that Donald Trump will actually rebuild the temple, that he will play the kind of role in the reconstruction of the temple that King Cyrus and King Darius the Mede played in the days of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah. He didn't express it in those terms, but that's what he essentially has said. This is most interesting. Now, let's point out that the David's tomb he's the chaplain of is almost certainly not the actual tomb of King David. The probable location of the tomb of King David is the excavated regal burial area on the eastern slope of the city of David, near the Arab village of Silwan. This area has been well excavated and is still being excavated, and the regal burial grounds have been found on the east side of the original Jebusite city, what had been the city of David in Jerusalem. Nonetheless, it's the traditional site, and it gives the rabbi a certain amount of public prominence. There are undoubtedly Christians of the conspiracy theorist nature who confuse conspiracy theory with prophecy, who are going to be saying, look, the Antichrist will be a deceiver, Donald Trump is a deceiver. The Antichrist is going to allow for the rebuilding of the temple and put his own image in it. Now we have Donald Trump. I don't think Donald Trump fancies an image of himself being worshipped in the temple in Jerusalem that he's going to cause to be rebuilt. Nonetheless, it's interesting what this rabbi is indeed saying. And it indicates the importance this week in prophecy of what is being ascribed to the American position of the Trump administration with embassy relocation in the eyes of the Orthodox Jewish nationalists. But so it happens this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, there is a tremendous reaction once again. As the Christ in the Checkpost event is being planned, one of its proponents has been consistently the wife of Bill Hybels, Lynn Hybels from Chicago, essentially an anti-Israel activist. Bill Hybels at his Willow Creek Church after September 11th, of course, invited a Muslim imam to explain Islam to Christians. Of course, there was no reciprocal agreement for a Christian evangelist to explain the gospel in a mosque. It's always a one-way street. And it's a one-way street that Lynn Hybels is prepared to drive down with her husband. But it is interesting that this week in prophecy, public accusations of sexual impropriety have been made against her husband, which she denies. We are not spreading gossip or rumor. We're not acting maliciously or vindictively. Nonetheless, these things are already publicly reported in the secular media. And we do not see it as a coincidence that as Christ in the Checkpoint is organizing, these allegations have been put into the public domain by the secular media. Let us continue. Looking at this week in prophecy, the Palestinian Authority is being overshadowed by the actions of Hamas in Gaza. Twice this week in prophecy, there have been violations of the Israeli border by Hamas terrorists, simply cutting a hole in the fence and walking through it. In one case, perpetrating a terror attack, in another case, trying to, 20 kilometers inside Israel at a major Israeli military base, they were tracked from the border to the base and intercepted before they could carry out the attack. Both of these violations are being used as propaganda by Hamas, saying, look what we can do, even without the tunnels the Israelis are closing.
Israel is to freeze the transfer of building materials to Gaza after discovering what it described as a Palestinian terror tunnel. The 1.7-kilometre-long underground excavation, reinforced with concrete supports, ran along its fortified border with the enclave. Israeli intelligence has blamed Hamas for its construction. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu brought up the find at a meeting of the Israeli cabinet. After praising the work of the army, he said his government remained committed to following a robust anti-terror policy. Back in 2006, Hamas, along with other militant groups, tunnelled into Israel and seized an Israeli soldier, holding him for 5 years before exchanging him for 1,400 Palestinians in Israeli jails. Meanwhile, on the Egyptian side of the Rafah crossing into Gaza, the military there have blown up a house suspected of hiding what they said was another Hamas-dug tunnel. Egypt accuses Hamas of aiding Islamist militants in its Sinai desert, using tunnels to smuggle in weapons.
This will demand a further buildup of Israeli security guards and military personnel along the border with Gaza. But at the same time, Gaza is engineering a public relations campaign. It has told its people not to go near this week the border with Israel and not to attack the other side of the fence, making themselves look like the victims. So that when terrorists perpetrate attacks inside Israel and the Israelis retaliate, they will be able to look like victims in the eyes of the international media. It's all orchestrated. It's a game they've attempted to play before. At the same time this is happening, they are preparing to organize the Great March of Return, or the Great March as they're calling it. Literally, the Great March of Return. They want to mobilize 1 million people in Gaza in a march. Now, the purpose of this, obviously, is to steal the limelight away from Mr. Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, and to draw the focus of all Palestinian Arabs on Hamas as the ones who have the real capacity to stand up to what they see as an Israeli occupation, howbeit an Israeli occupation of their own ancient land, which they captured in self-defense. The foolishness of this is evident. Israel is not occupying Gaza, it withdrew. On what basis can they contend that they're fighting an occupation when they're not occupied? But that doesn't matter to them, and it certainly doesn't matter to the BBC or to the CNN. It is the Palestinian Authority who is the power in the West Bank, not Hamas. It's Hamas trying to gain that power from their rivals, the Palestinian Authority. But that's only the beginning. They're orchestrating this march to coincide with Passover, Passover beginning tonight, Seder night. Hamas, this week in prophecy, conducted massive military exercises, virtual war games, using tunnels, not into Israel, but inside Gaza, to be able to move munitions and weapons undetected by Israeli reconnaissance capacities, be it airborne, satellite, or otherwise. They practice firing rockets, the use of gliders and drones towards the Mediterranean on a massive scale not seen before. They're carrying out war games in preparation for what seems to be a war. The Israeli press is urging its citizens to be armed because of increased infiltration from Gaza. It's urging its citizens to carry their weapons. That's significant. Now, a number do anyway, but now it's being pressed by government announcement to be sure you're armed in case you happen to be somewhere where there is a terrorist attack. These war games being carried out at the same time as the march is being carried out at Passover time is more than political in its significance. A preparation for war is a preparation for war. The Israeli media and government are speaking of the forthcoming war with Gaza. It's not, it may be. They're speaking of it as if it is inevitably going to happen. This week in prophecy, there was another possible setback for Israel. The Iron Dome, which has often worked so well, misfired based on a false alarm. Over 1 million people in the area of Sderot, Ashkelon, and the southern suburbs of Tel Aviv took to shelters. There were confusing news reports of a massive attack that wasn't happening, and the Iron Dome began firing rockets against projectiles that weren't even coming into the thin air.
Да они стреляют, мама. Это наши ракеты, Кипат-Верзе.
Wow, c'est nadir.
This may have been a technical glitch, a mishap within the Iron Dome system that can be, or undoubtedly is being corrected. Nonetheless, it provides important technical intelligence information to Russia and Iran, or to Russia via Iran and to Iran, as well as to their surrogates such as Hamas and Hezbollah, how the Iron Dome works. This is a problem. It has been suggested that the false alarm was a trick. It was done by electronic deception, assisted by the Iranians using Russian technology. This is not proven. It may have simply been a technical malfunction within the Iron Dome's computerized command and control system. We don't know. The Israelis, for obvious reasons, are not speaking. Nonetheless, all of these things are happening this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, trying to show gender equality, the Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas has publicly declared that women are co-equal as terrorists and as suicide bombers. They point out to one of their heroes or heroine figures, the Ian Maghrabi. In 1978, she was responsible for the most deadly terror attack on civilians in the history of Israel. But she was dispatched from a terrorist faction, at that time controlled by Mahmoud Abbas. That man is a terrorist with a terrorist background, the same as Yasser Arafat was. He's in no sense a man of peace. She came from his faction. They took over a bus on the coastal highway between Tel Aviv and Haifa. They murdered 37 bus passengers, 12 of them small children. And she's celebrated as a hero by the Palestinian Authority. Well, this is real gender equality being promoted and observed this week by the Palestinian Authority. This week in prophecy. And such it goes. Let us continue. Passover night. Last year, at a synagogue in the Jewish quarter, there was a ritual sacrifice of Passover held in the square in front of the synagogue in what's known as the Reva Yehudi, or the Misgab Ladach, not far from the Kotel, from the Wailing Wall Plaza. This year, however, in the shadow of the Wailing Wall, at the Davison Center. The Davison Center is a museum that is also the entrance foyer to the City of David excavations. I've been in it many times. Many of you will have been in it many times. Is going to be the location of actual sacrifices. Now remember, in times past, it was only the Samaritans who had their own Passover on Mount Gerizim who were sacrificing sheep. It was, of course, at Ramadan, Muslims were sacrificing sheep. But now, with the resurrection or attempted resurrection of a Levitical priesthood, we are beginning to see the Kohanim, the temple priests, taking shape for sacrificial worship. This time it'll take place much closer to the Temple Mount, literally in the shadow of the Temple Mount, very close, a matter of meters, perhaps 60 meters, perhaps 75 yards from the Mosque of Aqsa's Western Plaza. That means something. Together with Rabbi Yosef Berg's announcement, it is indeed not without significance. This week in prophecy, Passover week 2018 by the Western calendar. Let's continue this week in prophecy. Mr. Putin has responded to the massive expulsion of Russian diplomats in Europe and the United States with a counter-expulsion of at least 100 Western diplomats, 60 from the United States, after Mr. Trump ordered the closure of the Russian consulate in Seattle. Now, obviously, the Russian consulate in Seattle, like the one in San Francisco, is an operations point for technical intelligence, looking to steal high-tech information from Silicon Valley, from Microsoft, etc. It is economic intelligence, not simply political or military. It's been closed. There is a retaliation. Things are beginning to sour in the relationship between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, worse than they were. This follows the American killing of perhaps up to 300 Russians, by some reports, on the banks of the Euphrates less than a month ago. But Russia has stated the following. They accuse the Trump administration of preparing to attack Syria and possibly Damascus in retaliation for the use of chemical weapons against rebel forces and the local population at East Ghouta that we've been speaking about for the last 2 weeks. It is the contention of Mr. Putin's government that the chemical weapons were actually a ploy by rebel forces in order to provoke the Americans to attack Mr. Assad, using the chemical attack as a basis to do so, when in fact it was not Mr. Assad by the Russian claims, but rebel forces. In other words, they say it's a conspiracy. The people were, of course, killed, many civilians in East Ghouta, in that confrontation with rebel forces. However, the Russian Chief of Staff, Valery Gerasimov, has said Russia will retaliate against the United States if any Russian military personnel are killed, pointing out that there are Russian military personnel at anti-aircraft missile sites inside Syria. So he is threatening a tit-for-tat attack on American forces if America attacks those missile sites, which will be necessary to protect American aircraft, unless the Israelis do it, in which case the Israelis will have to take out those missile sites. Some have already been attacked, but the Russians were given prior warning. If these sites are attacked again, it is not unlikely that the Russians will be given prior warning. But it does show how dangerous, how much of a powder keg the situation in Syria continues to become. Not simply threatening to draw Israel into a shootout with Syria and with Hezbollah and with Iranian forces in Syria, but also provoking or inducing a potential conflict between Russia and the United States, bearing in mind what already happened on the banks of the Euphrates. And so it continues. And it continues this week in prophecy. My name is James Jacob Prasch. God bless, and thank you so much for listening. Tell somebody about the Lord Jesus this week. He is indeed coming soon. God bless.
Thank you, Jacob.